How is a freight train broken down or made up? How do freight cars get where they're going? Hi, this is Burr Stewart, and welcome to another operations video in my continuing series. Today I'm going to show you highlights from a recent operating session here at the Burlington Northern Railroad, and I know you'll find it a lot of fun. I'm going to delve into some details about how we actually do the operation, managing cabooses, locomotives, and getting a particular car switched in and out of several trains. So I'm going to show you highlights from several of the trains we ran and give you an orientation of the layout so you can follow where these trains are on the layout. We'll begin with the Sky Local. That looks like a long Sky Local.
Yeah.
It's named Sky after the town of Skykomish, which is halfway up from Seattle to Stevens Pass in the Cascade Mountains. At the same time, the Stacy Street Yardmaster is busy sorting cars over there. Wait a minute, where are we and what am I talking about? For starters, this HO scale model railroad is based on the Burlington Northern in the Seattle region in 1973. It makes for a nice complex layout because it has both north-south traffic and east-west traffic. Trains heading east from Seattle had to first go north to Everett and then turn to the right and go over Stevens Pass across the mountains. Here's a line diagram of my layout, and you can see me pointing to that route, going north and then over to the east. North and southbound trains just move up and down the main line between the southern staging in Tacoma and the northern staging in Bellingham, headed towards Vancouver, British Columbia. To make it as easy as possible for operators, I made an even simpler diagram at each station showing where they are on the string from the south to the right and the north and east to the left. So anytime you see a train moving towards the right, that means it's either south or westbound, and if you see it moving towards the left, it's either north or eastbound. Make sense? If I haven't lost you so far, this ought to take care of it. So here's the overall track plan of the layout. Trains start from the hidden Tacoma staging yard. They move through Argo Yard and Stacy Street Yard in Seattle. They go underneath the downtown Seattle into Interbay Yard. Then they move across bridge number 4 and into the long stretch of shoreline approaching Mukilteo, and then along what's called the low line towards the Bayside Yard in Everett, Washington. From there, they have a choice of whether they go north to Vancouver on the Delta Y, or whether they go, as I'm showing here, towards the east and up a long spiral grade, across a trestle, along the side of a hill, and through the index loop, ending on this layout in the Skykomish Yard, which is halfway up to Stevens Pass. And there's a reverse loop for returning trains in between operating sessions. Now the north and southbound trains, the northbound trains run from the Delta Y towards the left and up to the upper deck, is shown on the right here, past the town of Mount Vernon and into the Burlington Yard, which is a nice model railroad in itself, then climbing up to the Bellingham staging yard where the northbound trains terminate. Just for continuous running, I put a loop connecting the Skykomish and Bellingham yards, but that won't normally come up, and we have a couple branch lines to the north of that we run to. So that's an overview, and you can use that to figure out camera angles in the shots that follow. By the way, if you think that a 4-foot wide aisle between two active yards is good enough, take a look at this live footage. I guess it's good enough, but I wouldn't want it any narrower. Okay, well let's carry on with the run of the Sky Local. It just stopped in Bayside Yard there and picked up a few extra local cars to take to Interbay Yard, and now it's charging along the shoreline south towards Interbay in Seattle. Oh look, and up above the narrow gauge is charging along too. We won't talk about that anymore in this particular video, but you can check my channel for narrow gauge videos later. Keep an eye on that dark green Northern Pacific boxcar right behind the second engine. We're going to watch that get put into some other trains as we move along. Now we have a grade crossing at Mukilteo, as well as some tank cars and an old 56 Chevy. There's that first boxcar again. Just keep your eye on it. It'll get switched out into other trains. Fun to hear that clickety-clack of the wheels, isn't it? So where is Mukilteo anyway? It's near Everett Junction, just south of there. And on this chart, you can see the black dot. Mukilteo is in between Everett's Bayside Yard and Seattle's Interbay, or we call it Balmer Yard. It doesn't appear that the Sky Local, being a local, has any work in Mukilteo though, so it just blasts right on through. This stretch of shoreline route gives you a chance to compare the Chooch seawall product on the left with my handmade gravel glued on the right. I seem to be having trouble today with focus on the camera. There it goes. Oh no, are those points lined up for the diverting route? Uh-oh. It says right here in the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules, rule number 104, the normal position of a main track switch is for the main track and must be lined and locked in that position except when changed for immediate use. Employees must know that switches are properly lined for the movement to be made and that the switch points fit. Switches must be left in proper position after having been used. You hear that? It makes me really want to throw the book at it. There's one trouble though. I'm the one who did it when I was setting up for the operating session, and I'm the superintendent of operations here, so I don't know exactly how I can fire myself. Fortunately, no lives were lost, so I'm just begging for forgiveness from the rest of the crew. Another gratuitous horn blast as we pass the Ballard station and approach bridge number 4 across what's called Salmon Bay. You notice just inside the main line is a graveled spur track. This is the yard lead to the Balmer Yard in Interbay, and it's not on the prototype this far out, but Seth Newman pointed out to me that it would make life a lot easier, and further along this video you'll see exactly how useful it is. There goes that dark green boxcar I want you to keep your eye on. Well, it looks like our train was pre-cleared by the Yardmaster Joe there in the distance to just roll right on into the yard. And it looks like they're going to park on the B track. If you watched my original first video on model railroad operations called Part 1, Switching Interbay Arrivals, you know that the track they're pulling into is the B track. It's 2 over from the main line, so it goes main line, track A, track B, C, and then we get into the classification tracks 0 through 6. I'll put a link to that video in the description below in case you haven't seen it. As you may suspect, This is the main yard on the layout, and the black dot shows you that we're right in between all the south end spots to the right and the north end spots to the left. The Sky Local is a turn which originates here in this yard, goes all the way up to Sky Comish, and then comes all the way back. We just saw it on part of its return trip back from Everett to Seattle, and now of course it's coming to a stop. Now the Yardmaster Joe is going to quickly try to pull that train apart before he gets inundated with other arrivals and departures. Now the motive power has come off the Sky Local, and they need to bring it across the main line over to the Interbay engine facility while they negotiate that grade crossing and everything. This is as good a time as any to just give you a visual tour of the Interbay yard. There's the scale house on the bottom there for weighing cars. And on the back you can see the makeup of our Sky Local with the log cars, the gravel hoppers, and the coal hoppers from the three main industries up in Sky Comish, which are coal, gravel, and logs. And there's a beautiful Alco C415 there that belongs to Brian Elchlip that we're just playing with today. Our regular switchers we just have temporarily parked inside the car repair shed here. And the engine terminal on the back, and the maintenance of way on the left. Well, while we were watching the Sky Local, the southbound manifest freight number 139 has been making its way from Bellingham staging south towards the right and now crossing the Stillaguamish River. We'll be seeing more of this train soon. At the same time, the Bayside Yardmaster is busy trying to sort out his yard before the arrival of that same train. These tank cars are probably either to or from Mukilteo, and you can also see the skybox cars and aluminum chips from Boeing in the background. In our quest to stay organized, you can see from the black dot that the Bayside Yard here is just to the north of Mukilteo on the way up to Bellingham and beyond. But it's south of the Delta Y, so a train wanting to go east could go through Bayside and then take a right there. Meanwhile, on the south end of the railroad, Walt is handling the Lonestar Local, today operated with an Alco RS3 that was rebuilt by Brian Elchlip. Beautiful sounding engine. I made some separate recordings of each of the locomotives that he brought over here, so you'll be able to compare them and see what you think. That'll be a future video. As you know by now, 3 toots means we're about to back up. There, I finally got it in focus. Good grief. This area that Walt is working in the south end of the railroad is called Argo Yard and Vicinity. And this map shows you that it really is a model railroad to itself. We've interchanged with the Milwaukee, the Union Pacific, and a bunch of industrial switching. The priorities for the yard are listed over on this panel. And this map from my spins diagram booklet shows all the tracks and industries that are involved just in this one switch job. During the operating session, Walt worked here for over 2.5 hours and was just barely able to make a dent in all the switching. Here's a nice aerial view of this area. Well, back in Interbay, you can see that our Yardmaster Joe has been able to pull at least some of the cars off of the Sky Local that was on the B track and he's now putting them into the various classification tracks. He's changed which switcher he's using and is now using both of these engines of Brian's just for the fun of it, really, and the great noise that they make. It looks quiet in the yard here, relatively, but we're about to be inundated by what we like to call a situation. In the meantime, I have to say that I really enjoy a cut of cars snaking through S-curves in the yard. That just looks super cool. In the distance, Robin is bringing up some motive power that he just took off of an arriving train and needs to put it over in the engine terminal on the other side of the main line, which is what's going to create our situation. You can see him sneaking up on the C track.
So I just need to take these two across to the
Meanwhile, at the entrance to the yard, we have that very same train number 139 approaching, expecting to come in. They've just been told to hold at the throat and wait for further clearance from the yardmaster.
You coming out over here?
Yeah, I'm crossing over to the locomotive depot.
As you can see, Yardmaster Joe is blocked from doing any further work until this F unit gets out of the way.
Ah, the handle destroys the whole thing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That SP GP35 will be headed south to Portland on the next southbound freight. All right, are you ready for this? Train 139 has been cleared to enter the yard, and the engines are ready to enter the engine terminal off the main simultaneously. I promise you, this was not staged or rehearsed. Super cool, though, if you like trains. Did I ever mention that I like trains? Well, the engines look like they're coming to a stop in the engine terminal. But wait, it's not over yet. Joe's bringing his switch engines out, and he's going to make use of that spur track that I told you about earlier. That piggyback flat in the middle of the train is typical of the era. The railroads in 1973 hadn't quite figured out what to do about intermodal, so they would just throw it in the middle of a regular scheduled manifest train. That right there is my favorite thing about an operating session. Two trains on different tracks going the same speed, or the same direction in different speeds. Really cool. Well, if that wasn't enough excitement, over in Delta Yard, which is one of the 2 yards in Everett, a couple of guys have been trying to make up an eastbound train before heading up towards Skykomish. They had a situation there in the yard where they had to use the back track to make the train up, which is a little irregular, but what do I know? Seems to be working. Those Boeing Skybox cars came off of the jet job, which was run earlier in the session, and are heading empty back to Wichita, Kansas. Bang! A couple of minutes for pumping up the air, and they should be ready to head east. Let's just take another minute to look at the situation diagram here. Delta Yard is on the east main from Seattle to Chicago. Here they go. That is one long train. I wonder if they have room for it up in the staging yard at Skykomish. That could be another situation, but fortunately for you, I don't have any footage of that. Let's just say it worked out fine. Well, a little while later, back in Interbay, our train number 139 has exchanged cars with the yardmaster and is ready to leave for Portland. In the meantime, just to keep him busy, the northbound train has arrived on the A track. We'll let him deal with that while we follow train 139 south through Stacy Street Yard, Argo, and into staging. In this prototype location, there are 4 at-grade road crossings. On this layout, we only have 3, and I'm lucky if I can get an operator to blow for even one of them, let alone ring the bell. What are you going to do? Nothing's perfect. We're certainly getting the job done today. Although I seem to have trouble getting these locomotives in focus. I'm going to have to work on my camera technique. There, that's better. If you're ever visiting downtown Seattle, Wall Street is another great rail fanning spot, not far from the Pike Place Market. On its way south, the prototype BN main line goes through a tunnel underneath downtown Seattle. I just lucked out to have the staircase down to the basement be in the right spot to put the tunnel in there. That's a nice looking southbound through freight train. And remember I told you to keep your eye out for that dark green car? There it is. Joe was able to get it off the Sky Local and onto this southbound through train. That's what we call success in a model railroad operating session. Train 139's next move is to pull into Stacy Street Yard and fill to its maximum train length with any southbound through cars that the Stacy Street Yardmaster has to offer. In this case, I think it's a string of 5 or 6 cars. That caboose belongs to the Lonestar Local that we saw Walt operating a little earlier. In the lower left, there's a bench on the prototype railroad where the crews used to sit and wait for their next assignment. In good weather, anyway. To stay oriented, here's where the black dot is for the Stacy Street yard. You can see it's just south of the Interbay Balmer yard. And in addition to through freights like this, it also handles a number of locals and switch jobs. So here come the engines from our train 139, which under work rules are allowed to do one switching move in Stacy Street yard, so they're just going to pick up their cut of southbound cars. Bang! Looked like those got coupled up just fine. On the other end of the cut, a brakeman is waiting to pull the pin. Oh, that's a longer cut of cars than I thought. I think it's 7. A couple of minutes later, the rear end of our cut clears the switch. Then we can back up onto our train and go. All the while blocking Royal Brome. In the distance, the engines are going by some E8s that are getting ready to take the Empire Builder out from the coach yard. All right, now we're going to couple up our train and we can get going. Bang! Another long train for the good of the order. Pulling south out of Seattle's Stacy Street yard. That track with the reddish ballast to the right is called the Colorado line, and it serves as a switching lead for the Stacy Street yard, which can be handy when there's a lot of traffic. Well, now we're pulling past the Argo yard on the main line, track 1. And this train will terminate in one of the longer staging tracks in the Portland staging yard. Here's the diagram of the Portland staging yard, which is hidden underneath the hillside. It's hard to access the turnout, so I set up a diode matrix and a rotary switch in the fascia here. And you can see we're set up for track 2, which is the longest track in the staging yard. This is the approach to the yard in the dark, but we have a closed circuit TV camera that the dispatcher can use to see it. You'll see this in the next picture. There's an iPad on the left, which is displaying the conditions in that staging yard. On the right is the Skykomish yard. Remember we saw a northbound through freight arriving in Interbay with a red caboose just before train 139 headed south? Well, while we've been fussing around in Stacy Street Yard, Joe's gotten the cars added to that train and it's now headed north as train number 140. Meanwhile, he's of course doing more switching to try to keep up with the traffic. Now I want you to keep an eye on the layout behind where Joe is standing and see if you can see our northbound train number 140 come around towards the Bayside yard behind him in a few minutes. Meanwhile, we're watching him do some switching in the yard. I've sped it up so that we won't have to watch it in real time. Meanwhile, you can see train number 140 came around the corner in the back and is waiting for clearance into Bayside. There it goes. There, I slowed it down a little so you can see Dave pulling that through train into the Bayside yard to work with the yardmaster on changing out any cars that need to be changed out. Continuing with our speeded up mode, let's just watch Joe do some caboose handling for a couple of minutes here. This is a caboose he must have taken off a train that was headed north. Probably a transfer run from Stacy that came up to Interbay. Anyway, he needs to get rid of this caboose, so he's sticking it onto the caboose track, which is right next to the car repair shed here on my layout. I'm not sure where the caboose track is at their prototype Balmer. You can see there he just shoved it into the caboose track and uncoupled it from the engine and went off to do other work while he consulted with me. Now it turns out that what we ended up deciding to do was to make up a transfer run to Stacy, which meant we needed a caboose on the back end of that transfer run. So after having put the caboose away, he just came and picked it up again. Now, probably it would have made more sense to run around to the other side and pull the caboose from the other side, but he didn't think of that, and I understand because there's a lot of pressure on you when you're a yard master in a yard. So he's dropped that caboose there on the ladder, and he's going to run around the train by going all the way around to the back of the yard and coming all the way back, which he's done here. So he's come all the way around, and now you can see that caboose is on the very back of the ladder under his arm there, way in the back on the ladder. Oh, I was wrong. He's making up a transfer run to Bayside in Everett. So he's going to pull the cars that he needs to send to Everett and then tack them onto the caboose and then run the train over to Bayside himself. Because the operating session is winding down at this point and there aren't too many of us left in the room. And I told him to go ahead and run a transfer to Bayside before we call it a day. What's fun about that is that we can film the running of that train over to Bayside and the exchange of cars without too much interruption from other people. So I hope you enjoy it. I think he's slowing down here in order to flip a switch in the yard lead there. A minute later, from a slightly different angle, it looks like we're getting ready to back onto the caboose. Just a guess, but I think he's using an uncoupling pick to flip the switch in order to keep his hand out of the view of the video. Bang! Didn't quite couple, but we can fix that. All right, the air test done. Looks like we're rolling. That's a nice view of the cluttered front fascia where he has all his paperwork and maps and information for running that yard. On the lower deck to the left of Lego Town, you can see a bridge across to what will become West Seattle and the steel mill when we get around to building it. We'll just position ourselves at the Ballard station and wait for the train to show up, just like a real rail fan. Although on the prototype railroad, the weeds have grown up so high in this area that it's very hard to get a good shot of a train going by. These are two of Brian Elschup's locomotives, and the weathering on them is just wonderful. A GP38-2 in the front and an FA-2 in the rear. This is a typical Pacific Northwest consist. You've got some thrall door boxcars that are empty that were used for lumber coming down from British Columbia. Same with the bulkhead flat. Miscellaneous chemicals and cement hoppers, Milwaukee interchange traffic.
Do they stay on the low line or do they take the high line? Low line?
Very nice. Here we are coming along the low line, approaching Everett's Bayside yard. In the background, along the high line, is Everett's Delta yard and the Weyerhaeuser Mill B complex. This big blob of rock scenery is disguising one of the posts that holds up the house, but we plan to convert this into an expanded mill in the future.
Yeah, it should be clear. Yeah, I'm just working on that. This car you're going to take back. And
Joe and Lee are discussing how to turn this train around because Joe's bringing Lee some cars from Interbay, but Lee has some cars he wants Joe to take back from Bayside back to Interbay. We'll let them have at it, and we can go and check on the progress of our train number 140 heading towards Vancouver, British Columbia, otherwise known as Bellingham staging on this layout.
so all these drop, right?
Yep.
Well, here's the front end of train 140, and it looks like it's switching in the Burlington yard, probably dropping off and picking up cars before it heads up to Bellingham staging. This consist is very typical of the 1973 era on the Burlington Northern. You've got a Great Northern Jeep in front, a VN painted F unit in the middle, and a CB&Q Jeep on the back. Dang.
Okay.
While they hook up the air hose and pump up the air, here's a look at this long train. And let's just take a minute to look at the map of this Burlington yard. Here's where we are with the black dot all the way to the north, except for staging. Here's a map of the complexity of this area of the layout, with both the concrete branch and the Mount Vernon branch and the Anacortes branch. Here are the priorities for the yard. And here's an overview shot of the entire thing. It takes a person up to 6 hours to work that whole town. Well, air brakes released. We're ready for the climb to Bellingham.
I think it's all set. Yeah, it's set.
There's that red caboose that we saw originally pulling into Interbay yard on the back of this same train.
And then I'll pull these to get them out of the way. You want me to pull the car in this track or guy on the, we've got to get on the front end. Stop at this end. Get in your.
You can stop at this end.
Just put them on the front end of the caboose.
That's a pretty steep grade up to the Bellingham staging yard, but it's short, so we don't really have too much trouble with it. The biggest problem, as you can imagine, is the vertical curve at the top of the hill, which will sometimes cause a long car next to a short car to uncouple because of the vertical clearance between the couplers. But that's very rare. I use a mix of Kadee scale head and standard head couplers, and what I've started doing is putting the standard head couplers on my longer wheelbase cars so that they have a little bit more vertical play to avoid those instances. Meanwhile, back in Bayside yard, Lee is still switching cars around and trying to prepare the return trip of the transfer between Bayside and Interbay. It turns out the cars that he needs are on this back track, yard track 3, and he's going to go grab them, stick them on the caboose, and I think Joe will be ready to take the train back to Interbay at that point. Bang! There's a nice helicopter view of Bayside Yard for you. And on the right you can see the narrow gauge town of Paradise. Well, it looks like he got the cars he needs, and now all he has to do is shove them onto the caboose. As you know, I never get tired of looking at this particular switch engine. Tim Taylor was kind enough to re-letter it for the Burlington Northern, even though it was originally, of course, a Northern Pacific switcher. And 187 was actually based in the Auburn yard, but that's okay. That's close enough to Seattle. And this really gives me the idea that we're modeling the Burlington Northern in 1973, because they didn't repaint this switcher, they just put the DN number and letters on it. And yes, that's a recent release of the Rapido SW1200 with that ESU sound decoder. Very nice. Bang! How could I not show you one more parallel train move? How cool is this? So Joe's pulling out some of his train, and the switcher is doing a maneuver to get out of the way, and then he'll be able to charge off into the sunset. No doubt that Southern Pacific wood chip hopper is headed back to Portland for another load. Portland is as far north as the Southern Pacific got, but of course there were plenty of interchange moves that made it up to Seattle and beyond. As you've heard me say before, one of the interesting things that happened with the Burlington Northern merger in 1970 was that the Milwaukee Road got trackage rights all the way down to Portland, so that they could then help the Southern Pacific divert traffic away from the Great Northern Pacific route that had been used previously. It's interesting to try to model this prototypically. Bang! Did you hear that? The model banged before I did. Let's go back and see that again. That was definitely a model-caused bang. Just look at what you have to look forward to now on this channel as we get more and more sophisticated about how to simulate the prototype sounds. I can't wait.
When you break them, we'll have to walk either.
So for our last piece of technical wizardry, Lee is going to demonstrate his special little wooden pick that he uses for cars that are under tension like this. There's a little curved slot that he just sticks in there even when the cars are pulling, and he's able to get them apart. I'll show you more of that in a future video. For now, it looks like our train is put together and we're ready to head back from Bayside along the shore to Seattle's Interbay yard. But before we go through that last switch, Joe wants to do a little checking of his car card to make sure everything is in order. Looking good. Here we go. Well, if you think that was a long video, just be glad you weren't here for the entire 4-hour operating session that this is supposed to be summarizing. But seriously, I hope you've enjoyed this and you'll come back for many more. It's not always pretty, but it's almost always about trains. Right after this operating session, I was able to put a little tiny video camera inside a piece of rolling stock and take some cab view photos, and that'll be the subject of the next video. In the meantime, this is your host, Burr Stewart, wishing you much fun with trains.